It started as just another flight, just another routine day for everyone boarding. People shuffled down the aisle, tugging their carry-ons behind them, trying to find their seats. The hum of a jet engine filled the air. For most, the trip was nothing more than getting from point A to point B, a time to catch up on a book, maybe lean back and close their eyes. But for one couple, this flight was shaping up to be anything but ordinary. The couple boarded together, an elderly black man and woman. They moved carefully, taking their time down the narrow aisle with kind smiles as they nodded to those around them. Passengers watched as the woman held onto her husband's arm for balance, her quiet strength radiating with every step. Their presence carried a grace that was impossible to ignore, not because they demanded attention, but because they carried themselves as though kindness was their second nature. Settling into their assigned seats near the middle of the plane, they exchanged a few words and soft laughter, like they were in on some private joke. The flight wasn't particularly crowded, and the buzz of conversations around them faded into the background. Nothing about them seemed unusual, yet the smallest moments can become the turning points of an unexpected story. The flight attendants moved briskly up and down the aisle, checking bags, clicking seatbelts into place, and repeating their rehearsed lines about safety protocols. Among them was a particular crew member whose sharp, hurried movements revealed a sense of impatience. Her eyes darted across the cabin, her tone brisk, almost dismissive. At one moment she paused to tap her foot as a passenger wrestled with an overhead bin. At another, she curtly reminded someone to put their phone on airplane mode. To her, this was just another job, just another set of faces she'd never remember after the plane landed. It all began with the smallest of moments, not dramatic, not loud, not something you'd notice unless you were paying attention. It was during the drink service, halfway up to cruising altitude. A simple interaction, a brief exchange between that attendant and the elderly couple that set this story into motion. The couple, cheerful but clearly parched from the dry airplane air, politely asked for water. Just water. Nothing fancy, nothing complicated. They even made the request with a warm smile that you'd expect would soften the hardest disposition. For most people, this would have been an ordinary exchange. Something so unremarkable it's forgotten the second it happens, but not this time. The flight attendant hesitated, her eyes narrowing just slightly. Then, without missing a beat, she gave a sharp, dismissive shake of her head. "I'm sorry," she said bluntly. "We're out of water right now. Maybe later." The words landed like a casual dismissal, almost too quick to feel intentional. But the tone was unmistakable. There was no apology in it, no effort to make them feel understood or accommodated, no reassurance that she'd check for them in a moment. It wasn't just what she said, it was how she said it. The elderly man glanced at his wife, whose faint smile wavered just enough to be noticeable. For a split second, they looked like they were deciding whether to speak up, whether to push back against the brush-off. But they didn't. They exchanged another look, one of those silent conversations shared by people who've known each other for decades. And then, as if nothing had happened, the woman gave a small nod and quietly said, "That's all right. Thank you." The flight attendant didn't linger. She turned sharply on her heel and continued down the aisle, her focus already on the next person. To her, this was the end of it. They didn't fuss. They didn't complain. For her, there was nothing more to think about, but something lingered in the air after that exchange. Passengers close enough to witness it shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A young woman seated across the aisle from the couple raised an eyebrow as if weighing whether she should step in. The tension was subtle yet palpable, like the sound of static right before a radio crackles to life, and the couple, they went back to the quiet dignity that had followed them since the moment they boarded. The man leaned over to whisper something soft to his wife, and she chuckled lightly, a sound that somehow diffused the air around them. It was a laugh that spoke volumes, as if silently saying, "We've seen worse." But for those who assumed this small moment would quickly fade, that it was just one uncomfortable exchange in the sea of endless flights, they couldn't have been more wrong. What no one, including that flight attendant, realized at the time was that this story was far from over. What had seemed like an unremarkable interaction would soon unravel into something far bigger than anyone on that cabin could have imagined. And the flight attendant, she had no idea the wheels were already in motion, not just for this flight, but for her own life. You see, what that flight attendant didn't know, couldn't have known, was who exactly she had just brushed off with. Such little thought. That elderly couple, unassuming and polite to a fault, weren't just any random passengers. No, their story held a weight, a significance that could upend everything she thought she understood about her job, this flight, and the people she served. If only she had known. If only she had paused for just a moment longer to really see them, but she didn't, and as fate would have it, she wouldn't learn the truth until it was far too late. For now, the plane sailed through the clouds, its cabin filled with the sound of light chatter, the clinking of ice in plastic cups, and the occasional hum of a seatbelt sign flickering on. The world continued turning as though nothing had happened, as though everything was ordinary. Except it wasn't, because the story that began with a simple glass of water was about to take a turn no one, not the passengers, not the crew, and certainly not the flight attendant, could have possibly seen coming. And when the truth landed, it would shake not just the flight, but the very foundation of what it meant to judge others without knowing their story. But we're not there yet. For now, the cabin is quiet. The couple sits patiently, their hands resting calmly in their laps, and the flight attendant marches on, oblivious to the storm quietly brewing beneath her feet. The question remains, though, how long can a storm stay silent before it breaks? And when it does, who will be left standing? Stay tuned. The plane continued its steady ascent, the cabin buzzing with the quiet mundanity of a routine flight. Around the elderly couple, passengers settled into their own worlds. A businessman in a crisp suit typed furiously on his laptop, his expression tight with concentration. A child, a few rows back, giggled as she reached for the coloring book her mother handed her, crayons scattering across the tray table. And between all these ordinary moments, the tension from that brief interaction swirled unspoken, unnoticed by some, but not forgotten by others. The woman glanced at her husband, her soft, knowing smile returning. They didn't need words right. Now, over the years, they had learned when to speak and when to stay silent. Silence was often their safe harbor, a place where they could communicate everything they needed without the weight of the world intruding. They had been through so much together, navigating life with resilience and grace, shouldering challenges with quiet determination. But every now and then, moments like this, casual dismissals, veiled disrespect, cut deeper than they wanted to admit. Still, they had learned to pick their battles. It wasn't about letting things slide or ignoring the sting of disrespect. It was about understanding the bigger picture, playing the long game. And in this case, they knew something the flight attendant did not. The quiet confidence in their demeanor wasn't born from arrogance or entitlement. It was rooted in the certainty that they had nothing to prove. The woman reclined her seat slightly and reached for her husband's hand, their fingers intertwining. It was enough to steady her. They had made a promise to themselves long ago to never be defined by how others treated them. Still, she could feel the unease in the air around them. People had noticed. The young woman across the aisle kept glancing their way, her forehead furrowed in mild disbelief. A man a few rows back whispered something to his companion, both of them shaking their heads. And the truth was, no one quite knew what to do with the moment, so they did what most people do. They stayed silent. The flight attendant moved briskly down the aisle, handing out cups of soda to other passengers, her pace unbothered, her expression coldly efficient. When she occasionally glanced at the couple, there was no hint of recognition, no flicker of an apology in her eyes. To her, it was as if they already belonged in the past, their presence irrelevant now that the interaction was over, but there were layers to this story that no one on this plane could see yet. Beneath the surface of casual exchanges and subtle tensions, history and purpose quietly pulsed. The couple had started their lives in a different world, one where opportunities for people like them could feel few and fragile, a world where building something from nothing meant climbing uphill with the wind against you. Their story wasn't about privilege or luck. It was about grit and vision. Over the years, they had worked tirelessly, building not just a life, but a legacy. It was slow at first, small investments, late nights, sacrifices that most people would turn away from. But they had dreamed of something bigger, something that would reflect their shared determination and the belief that dignity wasn't just a luxury, it was a right. And through all that hard work, through decades of putting one foot in front of the other, they had created something extraordinary, but none of that history showed now. To the flight attendant, they looked like any other passengers, quiet, unremarkable, easy to overlook, and in the stark, transactional world of customer service, they had been filed away as inconsequential. She didn't see the quiet power in their resolve or the way their story had shaped them into who they were. She didn't know, couldn't have known, that the very airline she worked for was their legacy. The attendant paused further down the aisle to chat briefly with another crew member, her tone light and casual. For a moment, she laughed, a carefree sound that seemed to erase any weight from the earlier interaction. She had moved on, but the energy in the cabin hadn't fully recovered. People were waiting, watching as the silence stretched thin. The young woman across the aisle from the couple shifted in her seat again. She was one of those passengers who couldn't just ignore things. She had been taught to speak up when something didn't sit right, even if she wasn't entirely sure what to say or how to approach it. She looked at the couple, then back at the flight attendant, who now stood at the front of the cabin near the galley. Her hesitation was palpable. She fiddled with the hem of her sweater, debating whether she should say something or if her voice would even make a difference. The elderly man noticed her glance and gave her a faint, reassuring smile. It was the kind of smile that silently said, "We're okay. You don't need to worry." But the woman wasn't entirely convinced. She leaned toward the aisle as if about to speak, then quickly leaned back, deciding against it. Not yet, at least. Meanwhile, the couple busied themselves with the small rituals of travel, hiding their thoughts behind the thin veil of normalcy. The man pulled a book from his carry-on, flipping through the pages as if absorbed by the words. The woman adjusted her scarf, straightening its edges with delicate hands that had weathered years of both joy and struggle. They moved as if everything was ordinary, but beneath the surface they remained deeply aware of what had transpired. They understood the dynamics at play, the unspoken assumptions that could govern these interactions. They had lived through eras where kindness and patience were a necessity, not an option. Their lives had been shaped by moments like this, moments where their character was tested not by the grand gestures of others, but by the small slights, the passing dismissals that revealed more than words could say. And now they waited, not for retribution, not for validation, but for the right moment to make themselves truly seen. For the crew, serving hundreds of passengers during a flight, could blur into a single exhausting routine. Faces became interchangeable, names forgettable. It was easy for compassion to slip through the cracks. The attendant, conditioned by years of repetition, saw nothing unusual about her dismissive tone or the brush-off she had given. To her, these Interactions were transactional, impersonal. Her job was to keep things moving, not to dwell on moments that didn't delay the flight schedule. And yet, in her rush to minimize, she had missed an important truth, that every passenger carried a story that might surprise her. The plane continued its steady course, the sun streaming through the windows as if nothing was out of place. But the storm brewing beneath the surface was still there, its presence felt in the quiet glances exchanged, in the whispers between rows, in the unease that had yet to settle. The couple sat patiently, their stillness a deliberate choice. Whatever was coming, they were ready for it. And as the attendant began preparing for the next phase of service, she remained blissfully unaware that her earlier dismissal wasn't forgotten. A reckoning was on its way, and it would unfold not with anger or confrontation, but with the simple, undeniable power of truth. The young woman across the aisle couldn't get the scene out of her head. She'd been sitting there, watching everything unfold, feeling that nagging sense of discomfort clawing at her chest. It wasn't just about the water. It was the way the words were delivered, the absence of any warmth or acknowledgement, almost as if the couple wasn't even worthy of the basic courtesy granted to others. She told herself she should stay out of it, that this wasn't her business. But something about the couple's quiet grace gnawed at her. How many times in her life had she brushed off moments like this, thinking they weren't hers to address? Meanwhile, at the rear of the airplane, the flight attendant leaned against the counter in the galley, talking with one of her colleagues. Whatever conflict the passengers might have felt hadn't reached her. She sipped from a cup of iced tea, her focus on something mundane, a half-hearted conversation about her weekend plans. For her, it was another day, another shift, another flight to cross off the board. There was no malice in her actions. In her mind, she had been efficient, practical. Water was a standard service, sure, but running low and prioritizing others seemed reasonable. If anything, she thought she was doing the right thing. But perspective has a way of splintering. To the young woman still sitting across the way, the tension was now part of the flight, impossible to shake. She fidgeted, adjusting the strap of her carry-on for the third time since takeoff, while in her head she replayed the moment again. And again, the words, the tone, that slight narrowing of the flight attendant's eyes. Did it mean anything? Or was she reading too much into this? Was she over-analyzing something simple? Maybe the water really had run out. But then, why couldn't she shake the feeling that something deeper was at play? The elderly woman shifted slightly in her seat, her husband looking at her knowingly. "Do you want to read?" he said softly, his voice a low murmur meant just for her. "It might help pass the time." She smiled and shook her head. "No, I think I'd rather just sit for now." There was no frustration in her words, no bitterness, but beneath her calm exterior, her mind flicked through memories she hadn't unearthed in years. Encounters like this weren't new to her. She could almost predict the shape of them, the initial anger, the wondering whether she was overreacting, and then the quiet, settling thought that perhaps it was easier to move on. Easy, yes, but hadn't she moved on enough in her life? How many subtle moments of dismissal had she absorbed into herself? How many times had she accepted them without a second thought, calling it grace, thinking it made her stronger? At the same time, the young woman couldn't stay still. She leaned forward, looking down the aisle toward the galley where the flight attendant stood. Her stomach twisted with indecision. She wanted to speak, but to what end? What could she say that wouldn't make the situation worse? And even if she did find the courage to confront the attendant, what difference would it really make? The elderly couple seemed fine, resilient even. Maybe it wasn't her place to feel outraged when they seemed so composed. The atmosphere in the cabin remained strangely heavy, even as the flight leveled out at cruising altitude. The attendant emerged from the galley, wheeling the snack cart, down the aisle with mechanical precision. She smiled briskly at each passenger, asking if they wanted pretzels or chips, barely making eye contact before moving on. When she reached the elderly couple's row, her posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. They didn't say anything, didn't so much as look up at her. The man kept reading, his glasses perched low on his nose, while his wife gazed out the window, her thoughts far away. For a brief moment the attendant hesitated, her hand hovering over the cart. Then she moved on, offering the same options to the next row, as if nothing had happened. The young woman across the aisle noticed the pause. Was it guilt? Awareness? Or maybe it was just her imagination again, tying meaning to something ordinary. She bit her lip and tapped her fingers on her armrest. The movements felt small, ineffective, like the fluttering of a bird trapped inside a cage too small to stretch its wings. Her hesitation didn't escape one of the other passengers, a middle-aged man sitting directly behind the couple. He had been quiet up until now, but his body language spoke of suppressed tension, his fingers drumming against the seatback tray. Unlike the young woman, he had a calm kind of confidence that suggested he didn't doubt his instincts. "Excuse me," he said aloud, his voice cutting through the background hum of the cabin. The flight attendant stopped in her tracks, turning slightly as she wheeled the cart back a step. "Yes," she said, her tone clipped. "Can I get you something?" "Water," he said, leaning forward, "like they asked for earlier." He nodded toward the elderly couple in front of him. His gaze wasn't hostile, but it was sharp, unapologetically direct. The attendant blinked, caught off guard. "I told them we were out earlier," she replied, her voice steady but tighter now. The man tilted his head slightly, unimpressed. "Looks like you've got plenty on that cart now." There was a fleeting moment, a split second where the air seemed to get heavier. The attendant looked at the unopened bottles on the cart, the clean lines of the rows staring back at her, like tiny soldiers awaiting orders. She hesitated, then she reached down and handed him a bottle. He took it without saying anything and extended it forward between the seats, his silent offer reaching the elderly man. The older man looked at the bottle, then back at the passenger offering it. He smiled faintly. Warm, yes, but with a touch of exhaustion behind it. "Thank you," he said softly, taking the bottle in steady hands. His wife glanced at him, her expression unreadable, but her fingers rested gently on his wrist as he opened it and took a sip. The flight attendant said nothing and quickly moved the cart forward. Her hands gripped the cart handle just a bit tighter, her knuckles pale under the fluorescent lighting of the cabin. Whether she felt shame or indignation, it didn't matter. What mattered was that the dynamic in the room had shifted, subtle but unmistakable. The small ripple of action had brought everything bubbling to the surface, two passengers breaking the silent protocol of politeness to confront what others had either ignored or excused. But none of it felt resolved. It was only the beginning, a small fracture in the veneer of normalcy. Even as quiet returned, it was clear that this wasn't over. The couple sat quietly, their composure intact. But beneath their stillness was a storm waiting to unfold. And as the attendant worked her way through the cabin, avoiding their row with practiced efficiency, one truth remained unavoidable. The choices made in that cabin, no matter how small, were spiraling into something she could no longer control.